So it is a pleasure to welcome Peter Galison to today's discussion, which is part of a series on the exhibitions Iconoclash and Les Matériaux, in collaboration with the Centre Pompidou Paris, and in the framework of the international practice-based collaborative research project Beyond Matter. We are here today to discuss an exhibition that took place 18 years ago at ZKM. Iconoclash, Beyond the Image Wars in Science, Religion and Art, emerged from the collaboration of an international group of experts led by Bruno Latour and was mounted under the executive curatorship of Peter Weibel in 2002 at the ZKM. So, Peter, you were invited to the curatorial board of the exhibition by Bruno Latour. Is it right?
That's right.
Yeah, by Bruno Latour. So actually other members of the curatorial board focused on image wars in religion and art, and your contribution, however, being a science historian, was related to science. And your book, Image and Logic, Material Culture of Microphysics, which was published in 97, on what it means to do physics and to be a physicist, was or seemed to be a foundation of your contribution to Iconoclash. And generally, one could say that that your contribution examined two poles: the pictorial representative and the analytic logical approach to science, specifically mathematics, physics, and astronomy. And correct me if I'm wrong. And as you formulated in the essay, in your essay in the catalogue, it was, or it is still, a haunting oscillation between the concrete and the abstract, which you followed from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 20s. And you were following scientific image into the digital era, which was described also in the mentioned essay entitled "Images Scatter into Data and Data Gather into Images." So just to give a little bit of context, and maybe let's start with the beginning of your collaboration with Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel on this particular exhibition. So how do you remember that, and how do you remember the preparations of the for the exhibition?
So let me say a bit about my background, and then how these discussions that as I recall, it's now more than 20 years ago since we began discussing this. Yeah. But I'll do the best I can. So I began by being interested in imaging in science early on in a book that I wrote called How Experiments End. And in that work, which I wrote across the 1980s, I was interested in the epistemology, a kind of material epistemology. I was interested in the way at the laboratory practice level knowledge came to be formed. And I wanted to pursue the search for experimental understanding as altogether equivalent in some way to theoretical understanding. In other words, I didn't want to start by saying science or physics is really about theory and it's confirmed or validated or supported or falsified by experiment or by empirical knowledge, but rather that the laboratory itself was as important a site for epistemological inquiry as theory. And so I wanted to know how, in the experimenter's own world, they came to the conviction that they were looking at a real effect and not at an artifact of the apparatus or the environment. So to do that, I looked at a series of clusters of experiments, some from the early 20th century, some from the mid 20th century, and then some from what was then the more recent period, just preceding the 1980s or the early 80s in physics. And so that went from a desktop size experiment to small group collaborations to these what was then very large collaborations of dozens of people. Now, of course, they involve thousands of people, but at the time, these larger collaborations that were established represented a new form of sociality inside the production of scientific knowledge itself. So I was interested in this transformation of scale and scope, but also in the machines themselves that generated knowledge. I wanted to know what happened in a cloud chamber or a spark chamber or a Geiger counter or whatever the device it was that would represent, if you kept digging down, what was the sort of primitive epistemological moment, or was there one? Or were there different scales at which that occurred? So I began that inquiry in trying to understand experimentation and the culture of experimentation and instrument making as, in some sense, quasi-autonomous from the concerns of the theorist. A theorist might say, I believe in relativity for these reasons, or I believe in the antiproton for these reasons that are very theoretical, like I expect any process that takes place in physics to also be possible in reverse. Whereas an experimenter might say, I'll believe in an antiproton when I can see its track on a thin piece of film that I put in the path of an accelerated beam of particles. So that they had different standards, different ways of arriving at conviction. At the time I was writing this, How Experiments End, there was a growing interest in images in science, but images were mainly seen in the nascent STS world, Science Technology Society or Science Technology Studies world, as a way of showing that science was not just algorithmic or procedural, and that if you could show that science relied on images in some fundamental way, you were, in virtue of that, showing that science was somehow involved aspects of intuition or social production of knowledge, because it wasn't reducible to the simple algorithmic procedures of a unique scientific method, a kind of legacy of logical empiricism or the Vienna Circle, or a kind of parodic extension of those more sophisticated movements in saying there is a scientific method and there's a kind of algorithm by which you proceed. You have hypotheses H1 through Hn, and you have initial conditions, and then you make deductions, and then you test them. And that's what science is. So images were seen as a countervailing force to that. But I was never persuaded that that was a sufficient or even very interesting way of understanding images in science. I wanted to see images as a way of understanding that was pursued by experimental scientists, whether they were in physics or elsewhere, but it was not the only way that science could proceed. And for me in general, if I want to understand a concept, I always want to know what it's being advanced in contradistinction to. In other words, if I want to understand how knowledge is transmitted, I want to know how secrecy works. If I want to understand objectivity, I want to understand how subjectivity functions. I think that concepts are always, in a certain sense, in a dialogue. They're in a distinction. And so if you can understand the boundaries of a concept, you can better understand what that concept is. Otherwise, it just seems like it's everywhere and it means nothing in particular. I can't get a hold of it. So when I was trying to understand images, I wanted to know what were the anti-images? Who spoke against images? And that was a theme that began to develop in How Experiments End. But then I pursued much more in image and logic, which, as the title suggests, was really about two countervailing traditions of epistemology in science. On the one side, you had image making devices like a cloud chamber or a bubble chamber, or using film itself, nuclear emulsions, and that people tended to move from one of these devices to another because the analysis of images carried with it a kind of pedagogical handing down in the literal sense of tradition, of passing down from generation to generation. The people that worked on cloud chambers went on to work on bubble chambers and so on. So, and then there was another tradition, a tradition that was suspicious of images, that thought that anything could happen once. You can't trust your eyes. We want to use logic. We want to use statistics. We want to extract knowledge from the world in a way that does not depend on an analysis of images per se. And they too had traditions of epistemology, of pedagogy, and of material handing down. And so that triplet of materiality, epistemology, and pedagogy existed on both sides, and these two traditions struggled in some way against each other and celebrated each with its own confidence that they could gain purchase, that they could secure knowledge in different ways. So I began to look at this images in this way, of images competing with the logic tradition, the image tradition and the logic tradition, and how they began to fuse in the 1970s and 80s. And that was really, as you mentioned, the core of the argument of image and logic. And that's, I had just finished that, as you mentioned, in 1997. And Bruno Latour and I had long been discussing various things, but it was really in discussion with him that I began to be interested in this problem of looking at images and their opponents, as well as images and their supporters. So my memory of those early days, I thought Bruno's idea of bringing in art and religion was terrific. And I introduced him at one stage to Joseph Kerner, who he had not known, because Joseph had written so interestingly on iconoclasm in Renaissance art. And I thought that the art historians had a lot to say about how this image anti-image worked out. And one of the things that Joseph and many other people who have written deeply about iconoclasm in the art world over centuries have always emphasized is that in the art world and in the religious world that it's connected to, that people were never against all images. They were against certain kind of images. And in understanding that historical specificity and understanding what it was about images of a particular kind that they objected to, I thought that, that seemed that really resonated with me. And that had been something that I had liked a lot about what Joseph Kerner and the other art historians who study Renaissance, the beginning of iconoclasm and the growth of the Protestant Reformation, and the set of issues that surrounded image anti-image in the religion art nexus seemed really interesting to me. So when I remember very distinctly, maybe 2 years before we launched the exhibition, when we were in Bruno Latour's apartment in Paris, meeting with him and talking about some of these issues, that it really seemed like this could, there was a certain point where it had seemed just an amalgamation of these different fields, but I began to really, at least for me, understanding a way that I could conceptualize the way this triplet of religion, art, and science might come together. And it really surrounded this idea that we want images and we can't have them. And that idea, that central notion of our profoundly ambivalent relationship to images, wanting them but not trusting them, thinking that they are the path to understanding, but also a path to self-deception or deception. A view that we ought to be able to escape images, but always being in some sense, being driven back to images. There's a quotation which I won't be able to reproduce that Joseph introduced me to, of Joseph Kerner, from Luther, where even Luther, when he's thinking about trying to escape from the imagistic or the anthropomorphic in our understanding of God, says that we can't help but somehow always see to a certain degree our reflection in our conception of God. And I thought that idea that we want images, we try to escape from them. We try to use them as a stepping stone to other deeper or non-imagistic understanding, but we're driven back to images. That really was for me, the central theme. And it was what certainly was behind what I wrote in the essay about using data to create images, because we somehow want to collect all that data and the statistics and put it into a visual form to be able to give it a grasp, to grasp it at once and to lead us to new ideas. At the same time, we take images and we break them down into data and do statistics on them and an analytic understanding of them. We're constantly oscillating back and forth between these, in a way, these two poles of our understanding. So that was a theme that led me back to the battles in mathematics, Hilbert's ambivalence, David Hilbert, the great late 19th, early 20th century mathematician, Klein and others who were suspicious of relying too much on physical models with plaster and wires, these beautiful models that some of which we used in the exhibit. And a feeling that somehow if we relied too much on images, we could deceive ourselves. If you relied purely on images, you would never really get to an understanding of non-Euclidean geometry and all sorts of things that exceeded our ability to grasp through what Kant would have called the intuitive alone. So those are some of the themes that I remember. And then as we had a series of meetings over the two years or so before the presenting, before the exhibit opened, those were great. I remember talking to Boris about sound and, the whole idea of sound as a form of the auditory, as a kind of anti-imagistic inquiry. They were great, the meetings that we had, and very productive, going back and forth between objects and conceptions.
So it seems that that you were part of the exhibition development from the very, very beginning. So Bruno and Tua didn't come up with an idea to you that you should be part of an already elaborated concept, but you were discussing this topic of iconoclasm and whether iconoclasm can be discussed in these three fields, which then became part of the exhibition. So I mean, art, science, and religion.
That's how I remember. I mean, Bruno Latour and Bruno had organized something that he invited me to before this, called Laboratorium. When was Laboratorium? Do you recall?
It was in the 90s, in 95, I think, but
so
sure.
We had been discussing some of these themes even back then. I mean, I remember at Laboratorium, I gave a talk on image and logic, and I remember discussing, and we were in, that had a crossover with art, not so much religion as I recall, but Bruno Latour was interested in the laboratory. We were talking about, as the name Laboratorium suggests, and Hans Ulrich Obrist was key to the Laboratorium exhibit. And I remember many discussions with Bruno and Hans Ulrich Obrist about this nexus of laboratory work, art, practice, and science. So certainly, I mean, I say it was 1995. I take your word for it. I don't really remember. But then maybe a year before that, when we were planning that, I remember these discussions about that. And I remember the meeting very distinctly where we talked a lot about these questions of art, science, and laboratory practice. So for me, the discussions, as I recall, sort of continued along those lines. Bruno Latour visited numerous times Harvard in those years in the 90s, and he was an affiliate of the History of Science department. We had conversations there. I was often in Paris. I spent a year in Paris well, that was later in 2005-06. So, but I was back and forth a lot and talking with him in that period from the mid 90s to 2000. And I remember during that time, I don't know how much I mean, he was interested in iconoclasm in its religious history for all sorts of reasons. And we had lots of discussions about that. I remember one meeting where we met in Bern in Switzerland, and the group of the co-curators who had then been assembled, all of us were there, went to a museum in Bern where they had an exhibit on iconoclasm, which was absolutely, as you might expect in Bern, from a Protestant perspective. It was a triumphalist exhibit about the victory over Catholic, capital C, Catholic iconophilia. I mean, there were mock-ups and dioramas of smashing icons and dispensing with the money lenders. And I remember on a TV monitor picture of people, Catholics carrying the frond, almost anthropomorphizing the Catholic relative to the Protestant. And I mean, I remember that it was generally, I think all of us were sort of astonished that this was such a triumphalist exhibit. But I remember, it precipitated really deep and intense, heartfelt discussions about the role of iconoclasm in religion. So that must have been, maybe a year before the exhibit opened. We were already deep in planning when we went to that. I also remember that, I mean, I think one idea that I think is entirely Bruno's, but this may come to the second half of our discussion, was the idea of, in the exhibit itself, of having it be a kind of a fair, a kind of a literal marketplace of encounter and discussion and people calling out. And he had this
sort of assembly or
an assembly, but less ordered than an assembly, not people neatly seated around a discussion and properly raising their hands when they wanted to speak, but more like
an
a
agora.
village, a village, a village fair, a village marketplace where everybody
Mhm.
was coming together with their different goods and hawking them. So I like that idea a lot. And as I recall, that was really Bruno's notion. And then it got picked up, and we thought of different ways. I mean, there are lots of things that went on from there, but I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, probably it was more emphasized in making things public.
Hmm.
This idea, and good that we start to talk about this, because it's an important point to discuss a little bit the scenography of the exhibition, since we devote ourselves now with the Beyond Matter project to not exactly to recreate the scenography, but at least to model it and emulate it in a certain manner. And this is why it would be important to know the relation between your contribution, which you called, so you created thematic cells in the exhibition, and these thematic cells were put in a certain order, which had a certain relation to the scenography of an exhibition, of the exhibition as a whole. Could you maybe elaborate on that? So, like, what were the plans in regards to like conveying the curatorial messages through the scenography?
There are different dimensions to the way the exhibit functioned. We always had in mind that there would be an exhibit, that there would be a book, um, that um, that we didn't want the science, art, and religion to be completely isolated from one another, but rather to be intertwined and connected.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was something that I hadn't expected at all, which was, I thought, fascinating. And maybe there's a way to capture some of this, I don't know how, in the in the project that you're engaged with now. And that is that when we began to open the show, I don't remember whether it was a pre-opening for journalists or whether it was associated with a kind of broader opening, but I remember that the curators were all walking around different people. They were bringing different journalists or different guests around the show, and each of them narrating, each of us were narrating what we had in mind in different ways. And I hadn't expected the sensorial, physical impression that this would make. But the idea of having simultaneous guides crisscrossing through and seeing, Boris Groys going this way and Bruno going that way and Joseph Kerner coming across this way. And we were, um, you know, those of us who had the languages were speaking to different reporters in French and
Mm-hmm.
German and English. I remember that it made an immense impression on me. It was such a dynamic way of having the exhibit exemplified or instantiated, to have multiple courses through the same set of objects in some sense, and
Mm-hmm.
that the meaning and the narratives that we each had, we had some things in common. We'd been talking about this for 2 years or so, but it was also our distinct paths through it that we chose to emphasize.
Mm-hmm.
And, I, of course, took a path through the scientific instruments and objects and models and so on that I had brought together and images, but connecting them with the iconography, anti-iconography of the other dimensions of the show. And I mean, it left enough of an impression on me so that I direct a small museum of scientific instruments at Harvard called the Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments. And one of the things that I've experimented with is having labels that are changeable. So they're not stable, and they're authored. So somebody might go through and have one tour through an exhibit, and somebody else might have a completely different tour through the exhibit. And so you could choose which to follow, in a sense, or you could follow different ones and see the objects take on different meanings when their propinquity or their distance from other objects conceptually was emphasized or de-stressed. So I thought that moment when we each were showing this around the exhibit had a kind of radical effect on my conception about what a museum could be. And I think that, if there was a way to capture in your project the different strands, the different ways, the different literal paths, as well as conceptual paths through, that might capture what for me was quite, a remarkable and for me quite transformative experience.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing this moment, because it's really an important element to make the exhibition model performative, and probably this is the key term. So performativity should be, and also participation should be part of such an endeavor. Yeah, it's exactly the question how, but we are working on it, and returning maybe to the exhibition, um, and also now I'm a little bit hesitant if we shall return to the architecture itself, to the scenography, or if it had such a significance, particularly to you and to the cells you curated, or in the end it was just a gestalt which was holding the exhibits together.
Well, I mean, it's been a while. I don't think I could
Yeah.
reproduce for you the exact layout of things. I
Yeah, no,
remember
it's not about that.
uh, certain things I remember we wanted to highlight. We had, for instance, this beautiful flat cloud chamber
Yeah.
that was dark backlit and illuminated so that you could see the trails of vapor as these radioactive decays occurred, and you could see them skittering along. And we gave that a kind of highlight place. So some objects, and I remember that as in a sort of side room or side partitioned area, and other ones were more juxtaposed with other objects. Some of the objects were delicate, and some of them had, big steel structures and, and some weight to them. I think for me, the most important architectural or scenographic feature was not isolating the three components of art, science, and religion. I think it would have been easy to make it into a science section, a religion section, and an art section. And but that, I think, would have destroyed the central conception, which was that this, at least as what I would say, is that we want images and we can't have them. If I had to summarize the whole project, that's what it would be. And so I think the realization of that intrinsic tension across these different domains was what gave the exhibit force. It had it was not just an assembly. It was not just a hodgepodge of different things that, it had enough of a central core idea, at least the one that, as I say, I used to organize my thought about it. The other curators may have other conceptions of it, but I think we all would have my strong memory is that we all thought that the juxtaposition of these different things, to really have them in a continuing dialogue between art, science, and religion, was a central feature of this. I mean, after all, look, art has its root in religion. There's no question. Art shaped religion, and religion shaped art. And natural science and philosophy, or natural philosophy as it was called, clearly has its origin in religious inquiry, the natural world shaping our ideas about the cosmos and as well as the reciprocal. So I think that in a way we were trying to get back and show the continuing interaction between these things and how profoundly connected they are, but not by just a pedantic argument, but by really bringing things in the exhibit, in their material, as well as immaterial forms together. So that seemed to me quite important.
Yeah, and thank you for the summary. I think it's very important to emphasize that it wasn't only an assembly of objects coming together in an exhibition space, but their arrangement and their relation to each other had a certain significance. But returning to your essay in the catalogue, you start with the question, and I quote, what are humans good at? And your answer is pattern recognition, to summarize it. And my question would be, would you give a different answer now? So does the current leap in the development of machinic pattern recognition mean that computers are getting better in that than humans? And would it have an impact on the exhibits in an Iconoclash exhibition if you were to curate it nowadays, if it was next year or in 2 years?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a question that I get asked often, and it comes up both in the scientific work that I do and in the work reflecting on that. What extent can machine learning or artificial intelligence be thought of as, potentially replacing, or what is it that AI can do, and what are its limits, or what are its, I don't, I would never say that there's some particular task that artificial intelligence could never do. I mean, I think that the past is strewn with broken assertions of that type, that AI will never prove a mathematical theorem, or AI will never successfully beat a chess master, or AI will never play the game of Go, or AI will never be able to, do facial recognition or do translation. Machine learning will never be able to make effective translations of natural language. I mean, it turns out that a lot of those things have, to one degree or another, been successfully taken on. So, if you ask for the infinite future, what are their limits to AI? I would say it would be a bad bet to make a test, a specific task, and then be shocked if computers were able to do it. On the other hand, I think that what happens when we bring in new forms of computation, and is that it propels science in different directions, or it propels the kinds of things we can do in new ways. So tasks that would get you a PhD in physics in Berkeley in 1960, by 1965, some of those tasks were automated. And you certainly weren't going to get a PhD for doing them because the machine could do them faster and better. So, but that didn't mean the end of physics at Berkeley. It meant that people then went on to do other things. So that's how I think about the problem of pattern recognition, that the kinds of patterns that we value, that we're good at, shift. And that, I wouldn't say, I mean, nobody who pays any attention would say, oh yes, well, people are much better at recognizing faces than machines, because machines are getting really good at recognizing faces, and maybe to our misfortune, but they are. And so are there examples in mathematics where computers have been able to solve problems? Of course there are. Have machines been able to capture certain aspects of human mathematical intuitions? Yes, they have. But does that mean that the best mathematicians are computers? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that that may shift the kinds of ways that mathematics and what we value in what mathematicians do and what we think a mathematician is can shift. So I think that in the context of this show, if I were thinking about it today, I would definitely make bring into focus this question of what is it that AI, I mean, in the scientific sphere anyway, I would say, what is it that machine learning can help us with? And what is it that machines are really good at doing? And the answer to that question would be somewhat different than I would have given 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I was involved in this project to make an image of a black hole, this image over here. And we do use machine learning to teach the computer how to, in a sense, complete the image from incomplete data, and then how to test that and to make sure that we're not fooling ourselves. If you ask the computer the wrong kind of question, you get the wrong kind of answer. And so I think that back and forth between the use of computers to help us in making and recognizing images, to categorize galaxies, for instance, there are machine learning programs that are really good at that, and getting better, and will help. But there are other kinds of image recognition where computers are not so good, where you don't have enough of a training set, or you don't have enough data for the computer to be able to disambiguate things. So there, I think the future of computer vision and computer pattern recognition is still very much open, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of development there. There's a huge amount of resources being put into it. And I think that, setting those questions against what it is that the scientist or artist or a person of religion finds of interest and focus could be very intriguing. And I think that might be a thematic that I would introduce now that wouldn't have seemed quite so pressing when we began thinking about this 22 years ago or however long it was.
Mm-hmm. And probably the image behind you of a black hole would be, I assume, part of the exhibition if it took place now or in a couple of years. Last year, you also directed a documentary with the title Portrait of a Shadow, describing this decades-long struggle to produce the first image of a black hole. And I think all over the world, everybody knows about that finally this struggle was fruitful. And it seemed to be also for a layman a huge leap in science. And is this leap as big as so? can we say that it changed the approach to the scientific image? Uh, can we say that this oscillation, what you described in the essay, would shift towards iconophilia in the regards to the scientific image?
So let me answer this in two ways. The first has to do with the status of the image and the understanding of black holes and why it's become something of an iconic image within science. And the second is to go back and look at this work that Lorraine Daston and I did in our collaboration that lasted for many, many years, starting in the early 90s and culminating in this book, Objectivity, that we issued in 2007. So the first part, I would say that in studying black holes, one sees precisely this productive tension, this generative tension between looking for images and looking more analytically, so to speak, at the, that is to say, without images, at what black holes are. The two great, I think great efforts experimentally divide along that line. On the one side, you have the LIGO experiments, which measure gravity waves by these amazing interferometers, these gigantic establishments with huge mirrors that are unbelievably sensitive. And when a gravity wave from two merging black holes arrives at the Earth, it compresses and expands the space around it and causes a tiny fluctuation of distance of, a thousandth the diameter of a proton. But this can be recorded, and you can actually measure this pulse coming from this wave train coming from the merging black holes. And that experiment, which has its sites in Italy and in Louisiana and Washington State in the United States, and there are more stations being contemplated, and the idea of bringing it out to space as well is part of this, really gave extraordinary information about black holes as they got very close to one another and eventually found made into one bigger black hole. These are black holes that are relatively small. They weigh 30, 40, 50, 60 times what the sun does, but they're a tiny, they're very small objects, but there's so much energy released in these gravity waves when they merge that even if they're hundreds of millions or even a billion light years away, you can still see that, so to speak, see in a measured sense that ring down, which we've heard with that chirp that arrives at Earth that you've probably heard, where it goes whoop at the end. And from that fragmentary information, much can be deduced about the black holes that combine to make it. And it's a detailed, highly statistical and mathematically sophisticated process. And you make simulations for all the different things that could be happening, one black hole spinning this way, another black hole spinning that way, and what kind of ring that would make. And then there are the image making traditions on this, on black holes. One of which was just awarded the Nobel Prize, Reinhard Genzel and Andrea Ghez, who used optical telescopes to look at a star that's orbiting around the black hole, the giant black hole at the center of our galaxy. And by looking at how that visible star moves, you can deduce some properties of the black hole at the center of the Milky Way called Sagittarius A star. And what the Event Horizon Telescope was after was in the image tradition, but it wanted to get much closer than that star. It wanted to get really within a couple of times the radius of the horizon of the point of no return around a black hole, and that's what you're seeing in this picture of a rather distant supermassive black hole that's to which we made an image. What an image does, in a way, is to be open to the unexpected, whereas the analytical methods can pry a signal out of the background with enormous success. Those are the two great epistemic advantages of the logic tradition and the image tradition. The image tradition is, in a sense, open to what comes, or more open to what comes. And the analytic tradition is able to extract a tiny signal from an immense amount of noise. That's the whole project of LIGO, is to extract this immensely small vibration that is induced by the passing gravity wave from all the other noises that are occurring on Earth, seismic events and trucks and, all the things that happen to the signal on its way from LIGO to us, from the black hole merger to us. So they're complementary in this sense. And I think that our conviction now that black holes exist and that we can say a lot about their, more and more about their properties, has to do with the fact that we have these complementary approaches. I think in the case of this particular image, which I consider to be a kind of iconic image, in the sense that it's an image that causes a disruption in our sense of location and scale in the world. And if I was making an exhibit now, I would say take an image like Hooke's images of the flea from Micrographia, which had a similar effect, a kind of stunning recalibration of our relationship to the world of the small, which then, for all Hooke's own scenography, I'm thinking, for instance, of Frédéric Etouati's study in Fictions of the Cosmos, of those images, that they recalibrate how we understand our relationship to the small. Or the picture of Earthrise from the late 1960s, from 1968, 69, the various pictures. It wasn't that science fiction writers or astronomers couldn't imagine what the Earth would look like from the moon. They'd been putting it on the cover of books and making comic books of it, and it's not a huge mystery, but somehow when it was made photographically by the astronauts on the moon with their Hasselblad taking a picture, it had the same kind of iconic effect for us. It gave us, suddenly the Earth seemed relatively small, and even though we'd seen the curvature of the Earth even from ballooning in the more than 100 years ago, and then the various Earth orbit flights, somehow seeing the Earth from another orb in the background of space, what was so astonishing was it was of if there's one iconic image of that period, it was that image of the Earth, not so much, okay, this is the moon. It was the moon as the base, and then looking at the Earth. And I think that also caused a kind of, both for the scientists, the astronauts, the public, a kind of recalibration of size and scale that echoed deeply for people. And I think that the people that analyze these things tell us that more than 1 billion people saw that image of the black hole in the day or two after it was issued at 9:07 a.m. on April 10th, 2019. The resonance that had for people was, in a sense, I think, not that dissimilar from the way those of us who worked on it felt. There was something that was astonishing, a bit wondrous, a little terrifying, a kind of, go back to the 18th century, and there was a sublime aspect to it, right? A kind of fearful quality. Everybody who worked on the project, and there were more than 200, knew, had an idea what the image might look like. We'd done simulations for years. We'd struggled with it, but when it first appeared on our screen, there was something that was filled with awe and displacement, to be looking at an object, at a black hole, not just the size of the sun, but, out to the, past Pluto, a region of space and time that past the boundary of which nothing could escape, that this thing, that it took on a new, a deeper resonance of reality for us, a different scale. You think it's dichotomous. Either something is real for us or it's not. But I don't think it works that way in science. It's often, and we're in everyday life, is that things become more and more, can become more real. It's more of a sliding scale than a real step. So I think that image, like Hooke's micrographia image of the flea, and like the Earthrise picture of 68, 69, I think that there, and like this image of M87's black hole, I do think there are certain images that jar us, that displace us. And even if we think we understand the things there, that the images themselves have that kind of effect. And I think that happens with painting too, and through painting, and another theological inquiry in theology as well. I mean, we are constantly searching for our place, and in a way, how we understand our place and the role of art, science, and religion in helping us locate ourselves over millennia is, seems to me, in some ways, one of the most interesting questions that you can ask, and a question that lay, for me, central to the Iconoclash question, and as it was formulated 22 years ago. And if I was focused on it now, I'd make this question of place and scale and location in the world in the broadest sense, physical and metaphysical, as central.
Yeah, I think the image of the black hole is particularly interesting in this context, and even maybe even more iconic than the image of the Earth by an astronaut, because if that exists, and it's probably only a metaphor, but a black hole seems to be an iconoclastic phenomenon itself. Making an image of it seems to be an ultimate iconophilic act. This is why, but yeah, it's just a play with words. But if we go a little bit deeper into the content of the exhibition, so for example, there were devices you have already mentioned. For example, there was an Amanda telescope, which was very new at the time, but in the meantime it has been replaced by an ice cube telescope. And since we are going to create a model of an exhibition, would you consider that we should include the newer version of the Amanda telescope, so in this model, or we shall rather keep to the state of the art 20 years ago? It's a rather practical question after such metaphors. Yeah.
In a way, I think I mean, I think there's a fundamental question that you would have to ask in the outset of your project, which is, are you making a new exhibit, which is perfectly valid, interesting project that in a certain sense asks a question you asked me a minute ago, which is, how would you do this now? What would you, but in that case, you really need to put everything into question. What art would you choose now?
Mm-hmm.
What science? What would you make of transformations in theology in the last 22 years? How would you cope with a new political valence in the world? 22 years ago, the stresses and strains in culture and politics in Europe or the United States or North America would have, were very different. And, it was during the planning of the exhibit that I was in Paris for one of the meetings with the others, and when the attack, or just after the attack of September 11th occurred in 2001,
Yeah.
and we were talking about these things, and we would have described our world, I think politically, culturally, rather differently, and how we saw, the collaboration within this project, collaboration more generally, cultural diversity, maintaining our values in a period of stress. Now we have a very different, the demons that we face today, I think can't be externalized the way, Europe and the United States tried to externalize terrorism in 2001. Now these are rifts within our own cultures and within our own, response to the pandemic, and which, the pandemic and the politics and the culture are caught up with one another, and science and technology are in a different place. So in a way, I think there's a very interesting question you could ask, which is, what would such an exhibit look like now? And how would politics figure in it? There's a different question, which is, if you wanted to use these new techniques of laser scanning and other things to try to do a three-dimensional recreation of the exhibit back then, how would you do it? And I think there's a fork in the road there that not that you could, we never look at the past completely archaeologically, to use Foucault's term. It's always layered by our experience between then and now, technologically, but also in every other way, culturally and artistically. And, we can't look back on a painting that was contemporary in 2000 and see it the same way now. Or in scientific terms, you take that telescope as it existed then, or do you look at its upgrade and reformulation under new technological and scientific pressures? So I think that's a question really that's for you and your colleagues on the Immaterial project to decide. Are you trying to re-envision a world of 2000, or are you trying to say, okay, that was a project then, we're now going to do something that begins with that, but it's more like a jazz improvisation on an old tune. We're going to use the whole history of museological inquiry and scientific, technological, political, and we're going to say, what would it be to think about iconophilia, iconoclasm, iconography in 2021 or 22? So I would return the question to you, which is, which path would you want to follow. And there are overlaps between them clearly, but how much are you trying to capture a moment, and how archaeological and how genealogical is this project?
Well, this is why I'm conducting the interviews to throw the question back to you to find that fine line in between, because I don't think. I think we should do both, actually. And the question is how to create an approach, or actually we could also have two approaches. We could have multiple approaches, because we are not bound to any physical location. So we could even think of layers, and maybe this is the closest answer I can give right now.
I mean, that would interest me. I would think that to try to work through memory and artifacts from records, photographs, writing, all the traces that we have of the exhibit, whether they're memory traces or inscriptions or diagrams or video of the exhibit, to try to capture some aspect of what it was, but to embed it in how we would see it now, and looking forward. I would be very interested in that. And as I say, there are these other things that I would do things differently now, because the world has turned quite a number of times since in the last 2 decades. And this, for me personally, the work on the black hole image came out of these concerns. I mean, my work in image and logic, and then my interest in the work with Lorraine Daston on the different ways that objectivity has been defined through images, through the work on the Iconoclash show, and these considerations. When we were talking about, in the scientific work, when we were thinking about the image, we found it useful to use some of the categories that Rainey Daston and I had developed in objectivity. And I began to think about an approach that would use scientific judgment or trained judgment, idealized images, and kind of mechanical objectivity, these three themes that we wove through the objectivity book as three different approaches to making the image. And they all are layered into the image that finally comes to exist. So I think that the back and forth between the science and the art and these themes, for me, have wound together in all the aspects of what I've been doing these years. I just finished a feature-length film called The Edge of All We Know, which is about this much deeper inquiry into the black hole, making of the black hole image, and theoretical work in parallel to it that was not imagistic. So these themes continue to preoccupy me: the materiality of epistemology, the relationship of the abstract and the concrete, the imagistic and the analytical, logical. So, if I were to pursue this question of the exhibit, the Iconoclash exhibit, rendered through the intervening years, it would be around those themes and along the lines that you and I have just been discussing.
Thank you very much. So it's a great last word, and it's a great help for our process. And yeah, so thanks again for the discussion, and
thank you, and keep me up to date on your progress with this program of this project of the immaterial. And I look forward to talking more and following and helping in any way that I can.
Thanks a lot. So then hope to talk to you soon.
Very good.